So 15 Million Merits is an episode from Black Mirror where those in society must pedal on bikes to earn merits, which is a form of currency. And so this episode focuses on Bing, who's one of the people that pedals. He meets Abby, she's also somebody that pedals, and develops feelings for her. So he overhears her singing in the bathroom and decides to buy her entry into Hot Shot, which is a singing reality competition, and it costs 15 million merits, which is everything he has, basically. And so this is significant because if, she doesn't go, on this reality show, she's just stuck pedaling for the rest of her life. And really the only way you can even have a chance out of this life is if you go on this reality show that costs a lot of money and the judges like you. So she ends up singing on the show and she does really well. However, not well enough, and basically she is pressured by the judges to go into the porn industry, and they really heavily pressure her into this. They say it's either that or back to the bikes. Other people would be so grateful to be here and you're just wasting your chance. So she ends up accepting. She feels guilty and she's crying when she accepts, and so Bing tries to go onto the stage and get her off, but he is carried away, so he is not successful in that. So then after this, he goes back to being on the bikes, and he witnesses on the screens Abby during one of these porn shoots, and he ends up breaking down and loses it, and he breaks the screen that's in the room he's in. And so after this, he works hard to earn 15 million merits again, and he enters the competition himself. So once he finally gets in, he reaches the stage and performs a dance number until he pulls out a shard of glass from when he broke it and puts it to his throat and threatens to kill himself. And then he gives this raw speech about the reality of life that himself and the others of the episode experience. And so the judges end up applauding him and offering him a shot at, being on one of the streams, that they offer to, give these rants now for people. So he ends up accepting the offer, and we see him giving one of the rants after he accepts. And so we also see him in a room that is like the cubicle he was in before, but larger. And so the closing scene is him, looking out over the tops of trees as there's a blue sky stretching on above him. And the episode is actually the first that was ever written, despite it being the second episode in season 1. And I think it really sets the tone for the series about messages about technology. And so 15 Million Merits argues that technology perpetuates inequality and oppression against those who are marginalized and not privileged in society. So if we're going with the grain, everything in society costs money. We see this from how Bing is charged for soap, his entry to Hot Shot, to turn ads off even, just solely that, customization features for the doppels, which are their online avatars, explicit content, food from the vending machines. Bing even remarks in his speech near the end that they would likely charge his twitching cadaver for getting blood on the walls, so that shows the extent of which they are charged things. So another with the grain reading is that corporations and the system exploit consumers and only care about what you can do for them. So this is seen in the show how those that are biking and pedaling are only referenced when their labor is mentioned. So the judge from Hot Shot is saying, who do you think pays for these lights? And that's really the only time the judges acknowledge the reality of everyone who's pedaling. And this leads into another point that corporations feigning like they care about consumers. So the judge is trying to say that, the people that are pedaling would kill to be here. They work hard to power that spotlight you're under. But they're only saying this to manipulate Abby into going into the porn industry. They're not saying out of it a genuine concern for the people who are doing the labor. They're just using that as manipulation. So another reading is lack of free will. And so, it's posed in the society that if you work hard on the bikes enough, you can get out. On one of the ads for the Hot Shot show, it says they were like you once, biking day in and day out. And so Abby is thinking she can escape fate, but she becomes part of the system. And not only that, but she falls into one of the most exploitative aspects, the porn aspect. And Bing as well is like this. He tries to change the system in a more radical way, and he also still becomes part of it. And this also leads into how authenticity is being used in capitalism. So in capitalism, authenticity is valued, yet it's actually an attempt still to just get money and keep those complacent within the system. So for example, there is a red-haired character, he's a male, and he feels empowered when he listens to Bing ranting, because Bing is talking about, the system, but still he's in the system. It doesn't change his reality, it makes him feel like something is different. But Bing at that point is a part of the system, and the red-haired guy is just still engaging in it, but he feels like this is an act of rebellion, but it's not. We see Bing still in his little cubicle. He's a part of it fully at this point. And it also, to me, relates on how, nostalgia marketing is a huge thing, and how that is something that was authentic, but it's used for profits in a way that it just feels very cheap nowadays. And also how people want authenticity, yet it's manufactured and fake within capitalism in general, and it's performatively done for profits. Like I said, with like the nostalgia marketing and other aspects where people, share their struggles, but it will still end up being like an advert for an online therapy service or some kind of service. There's like ulterior motives that are not being mentioned. And this is also related to how those who value authenticity are ostracized in society. So Bing is not like those around him. You can tell that he feels very different to people around him by the way he just solely keeps to himself. Like, there isn't a lot of communication in general in this world, but he solely keeps to himself. And every time he speaks, it's pretty much about how he dislikes the world around him. Like when he talks to Abby, one of the first conversations with her is about, the world they're in and how everything is fake. So he does not feel like he belongs in society because of how fake it is. And so this raises the general, theme of artificial versus genuine, what is real and what is fake. And, it can be hard to tell in capitalism because people have ulterior motives. So, like, this can be seen how Bing does his speech originally and then during the slot session when he gets offered it. So during the original speech, we can tell by his emotions that it's, genuine. It's passionate, it's angry, it's explosive, it's raw, he curses in it. And then during the other one, it's more composed and fake, and it's like manufactured outrage just, for this performative act. And then he says tune in next week, so it's like a reoccurring thing, whereas the other thing wasn't meant to be reoccurring, it was just meant to change stuff. So entertainment as a dominating factor in the world. So this is seen through how Hot Shot being a reality show, there's game shows called like Bother Guts, there's the porn and video games. These are all entertainment aspects, and this is like the main form of media in this world. Like nothing is genuine, it's just all entertainment. That's pretty exploitative. And so this leaves nothing left in the real world that's actually genuine. And so screens replace human relationships. So this is seen by those on the bikes don't talk to each other. They just watch the screens in front of them. And in the elevators where they get up to the bikes, they don't talk for the most part. And a lot of the time is either spent in their rooms looking at screens, which surround like them in the entire room. Like on every wall there's a screen, or, on the bikes at the screens. And so this makes them isolated. Despite being around people, they're isolated. And this relates to, in our society about how, we have people around us everywhere, but we're still isolated because a lot of us are on our phones, and that's like the primary thing we engage in. And it's the same thing here. The primary thing they engage in is this virtual world with the doppels. It's not the world around them. So, also, when they're watching Hot Shot, all of the people that are in the audience virtually are just sitting in their rooms, but they're in a crowd in the virtual world. And it kind of reminds me of like the metaverse stuff that's going on right now. I just wanted to bring that up. So another point is how people are forced to engage in consumerism and capitalism despite having no choice. So, everything costing money. And when Bing tries to like close his eyes in his room to escape the porn ads around him, there is an annoying beeping sound until he resumes watching. So he is literally forced to engage in the exploitative material that he doesn't want to. There's no free will, there's no choice. And obviously oppression as a theme in this society, that's a huge with the grain about fat phobia, sexism, racism, classism. I'll come back to these later, but just as a premise. Another point is how there's a need for wealth and privilege to escape the system, and even then, it still won't work. The porn industry is a huge thing that's talked about. So one of the people says how Wraith, which is the company, treats her well, which you can tell by her expressions is not true. And she mentions when talking, now this is Abby speaking here, so when she actually goes into the industry in an interview, she mentions how I'm now in a beautiful place with beautiful things, it's a dream. So focusing on things is very capitalism centric. And also the way that it's a dream kind of ties back to when Bing says, I have a dream, or like, we had a dream supposedly in a speech. I'll also touch on that, but it kind of shows that it's not really a dream, it's just an artificial capitalistic monstrosity. So like I said, Bing can't escape the porn ads, and they cost money to skip them. They also cost money to watch them. There's really no way, either way it costs money, so you're just put in a scenario where you have to pay regardless, which is very, very relevant in our capitalistic society. We, in our world too, get pop-ups for like porn ads, everywhere, even when we're not trying to look for them. They're just everywhere, they're pervasive. And sexualized media is everywhere. In this society, in our society, Abby, in the porn scenarios, she is dominated and forced into submission. And yet, like in our society at the same time, people are weirdly Puritan. So like in America, in this world, people are not even talking. Like they're not even talking or really interacting or even like holding hands, except for the one scene with Bing and Abby. Yet porn is everywhere. It's a very jarring dichotomy, and I think that happens a lot of the time, in our society as well. So Another with the grain is how sacrifice is just a theme, specifically by Bing, and how he pays for this. So he paid for Abby to get in, and this is actually the thing that breaks him because he ends up having to watch her. So it could be kind of like a reading on how if you engage in this exploitation, that you are part of a system and it will eventually have consequences for you. And even if you try to have goodwill in a system like this, it corrupts it because the system itself is corrupt. So going along with the porn thing still, porn corrupting genuine intimacy is another with the grain thing here. So Abby and Bing have a wholesome relationship. They hold hands, which is more intimate than the porn that's being shown around them. As well as like Bing, he ends up buying the ticket for her, and it's immediately followed by a porn ad. This is also foreshadowing, but it just shows that it corrupts their pure relationship and invades every facet of their lives. Also, another with the grain is how reality TV shapes narratives. So when Bing and Abby are both on this, they are both made to say things into a camera that they necessarily don't want to say, but it's for the company, So entertainment as a way to success, very prevalent in our world too, and the entertainment industry as exploitative and a spectacle. So this is seen through Hot Shot, as well as Bother Guts, which is a game show where larger people are basically humiliated and laughed at on screen. And so in general, there's an emphasis on the virtual world, like I mentioned, like the metaverse and stuff in our world, and how there's like in the virtual world in this show, there are instruments in there, there's a change in scenery, like different, it's winter or summer, and there's like outfit changes for the doppels, but in like the real world, they all have the same outfit, they see the same scenery every day, they can't play instruments, and they can't even keep things. Like they can't even keep objects that they make. So also another theme is how like people that are lower in society are blamed for their own oppression. So like when they said to Abby, they would do anything to be here and you're the reason, that they're, having to put all this effort in and you're just sitting here. She's blamed for their oppression when it's the judges and the system, and that's actually at fault. But she is made to feel like it's her problem and it's because of her. Another with the grain is how only the 1% in this world have good conditions, and it reflects like in the US, there's like a very small percentage of people that actually get benefits, despite most people being like working class and poor. And so it also discusses the ways one must survive in a system like this. So when Bing is trying to get into the show himself, so he eats like leftovers, he works constantly even when others are asleep, he hardly spends and he's very frugal, and this is definitely representative of like the poor struggle in America and like the things that those who are lower class must do to survive in this world. So like I've already said, the last thing I'll be touching on in this section is just authenticity in general. So Bing is very focused on authenticity. He makes quotes like, I just wanted something real to happen for once. That was the most real thing I've seen all year, in reference to her singing. And like he says in his speech at the end, people are so desperate for this because they don't get it. And, he's kind of talking about himself in a way there. So music also serves as a form of authenticity. So when, him and Abby talk, the music is swelling and it's nice and sweet. Or when he's like breaking down, it's like a very specific tone that goes with that. And so some of the most authentic moments are the Bing and Abby relationship when they hold hands in the elevator. Very authentic, very sweet, raw emotion there. And Bing's 2 breakdowns, like the one on stage and the one in his cell cubicle thing. As well as Abby singing alone in the bathroom. These are all pure moments that are, untainted, except until the society taints them, and then they have other meanings. Some against the grain thoughts that I have are me wondering where the clothes come from. So how do they get them? Because obviously we don't see any like stores or anything. So I'm just wondering how they get the clothes and who is making the clothes in this world, because it seems like everybody is just doing this bike thing. We see a zoomed out, picture of this place and everyone's just on the bikes. But what about the people that make clothes? Who's manufacturing the food, So how do they end up in this like area with the cubicles? How are they selected to be in it? Is everybody in these cubicles? Because it seems like it's not. Like Abby talks about her sister being in some other thing, which I'm going to touch on in a little. So how do certain people end up here? I also wanted to say in Against the Grain reading is that it's an analogy for the 9-to-5 life. So this is kind of like an office job situation. So like the rooms are like cubicles, they're small and cramped, and there's also screens everywhere, which represent computer screens, which office workers constantly look at. And the day is also very monotonous. 9-to-5 routines are like this as well. And also the monotone colors are kind of reflective of this as well, because offices are known to be very like bland and sterile. I also wondered, what about babies? Like, what are they doing? Like, what is society doing until you get to this point? Because they obviously can't bike, so what are they doing with babies? And it also seems like no one interacts. So what about procreation? How are people making more babies in this world that seems like no one's interacting in it? Also, I was wondering about the significance of the colors. So the people that are on the bikes all wear gray, which makes sense to me, but the yellow, which The people who are overweight, who work as like cleaners wear, they all wear yellow, but usually yellow is an optimistic color. So it's strange that they would decide to have them in yellow. So I'm just wondering what the symbolism is with that. Also, it was never really touched on the fact that Abby and Bing are still an interracial couple and the implications of that. So I'm just wondering more about that. There's also mention of this thing called the Air, which is something the sister is apparently in, and she mentions it's full. No idea what it is or why it's full. Made me wonder about that. There's also gender-neutral bathrooms, which I thought was interesting as an against the grain reading. Also the idea of the implications of Bing, who is a black man, giving Abby, a white woman, a shot and getting, essentially screwed over. Kind of gives me an against the grain reading about how people of color are exploited and used by white people. Abby mentions upgrading your MOS. I don't know what that means, and I was wondering, more about that. She also mentions wall buddies, which talk after shut-in, which is an interesting type of terminology, and solve problems. And it kind of reminds me like how in our world today we think we can self-help our way out of oppression, and you're using the technology that's made. So it's like we're using technology to solve the oppression made by the system, but the system is perpetuating the oppression, and we're using the technology made by the system to deal with the oppression. It's just like a vicious cycle, which one of the characters mentions and says himself. So I also feel like wanting to get into hotshot could be an analogy for immigration, because there's like waiting around, they're in like a waiting room and they wait. It takes a while and it's unfair, like the selection process. And it's kind of what they have to go through before getting a shot at like life, out of the system. And it's like a way of where immigrants feel they have to go through this to get a shot at a better life. And so this woman who's in there is also eager to prove herself. I feel like many immigrants are eager to prove themselves, so they're like accepted and, given a chance. I also thought it was interesting that the avatars show more emotion than the people themselves, which is a result of like the emotionally stunted society. And so when Abby or anyone goes on stage, they drink this drink called a compliance drink, which can be seen as like, all right, this word clearly equals compliance, but what does it actually do? Does it sedate you? Does it like make your mind not work? What does it actually do to make compliance happen? And also it shows Bing having stored it under his like mattress, and I wondered why. Is it because it reminds him of Abby? Is it because he's just pretending to drink? Like, why did he end up keeping it? As far as the sociological imagination goes, so these people are desensitized to the world being like this, and they're also in a world that is hardwired for technology and entertainment, so they just accept these things as fact. And in general, the values of this world, which are entertainment, progress, these are reflected in the society and the people that believe it and buy into it. And the wealth disparity is normalized. And it's the same thing with the treatment of the lemons, which are the bigger people who are the cleaners. The way Dustin just is mean to them and treats them like they're nothing, like they're objects, like they're not people, this is normalized. And so once again, they're charged for everything. They're used to it. They just know that's how the world is. They don't think to fight the system, because how can you fight a system that is just so pervasive and it seems like there's no way out? And in general, isolation affects relationships. So I think that's also part of it in why the relationships don't really form and the people in the society are emotionally stunted. So for the concept section, so inequality is one of the largest I'm going to talk about here. Sexism, the most pervasive. I have a lot to say about it. So the treatment of women in this episode is abhorrent. Dustin, who's one of the people on the bikes, about Abby talking to Bing, is saying, I'd love to ruin that. Once again, the way women are used in exploitative manners by men. Even though he doesn't get a chance with her or anything, it's still the way he wants to, reflecting the misogynistic mentality of all of the men in the society. So when Abby is on Hotshot, there's a Wraith judge, so it's also weird that one of the judges for a singing reality competition is a man in the porn industry. So he says to Abby, I want to see them titties, and tries to get her to flash the audience before singing. So once again, her physical attributes, her status as a woman is being used against her, and she's being seen only in this objectifying, horrible way. And then she's pressured into doing porn, so there's that. And the men are not pressured in the same way to do things like that, so it's about the women. Another judge that's up there, so there's two judges that are men, and then one's a woman. So there's another male judge, who says, your looks get in the way, and I'm picturing you in an erotic scenario. Also, there's definitely, like, a huge age difference. She's, like, around, I think, young 20s. This guy is at least 40s and 50s, so that's weird, too. And the way that he just is picturing her in this way, once again, shows men objectifying women in this society. And it's showing how women are only valued for ways that they can be sexually exploited and their appearances. It's very surface level. And there's also a remark about how Wraith, the porn company, can play with Abby's innocence, which is so gross, that innocence and purity are sexualized and ruined by men, and how girls' childhoods are taken away from them by men. It's horrible. So the female judge, I think, is interesting too, because she hardly speaks up except to eventually affirm the male judges. And I think this is because, women don't feel comfortable speaking up. She's outnumbered by the men. But she does cry. You see her, cry. There's, a close-up on her crying when Abby accepts the offer. So I think she understands what Abby's going through, even though she's, kind of appeasing her, the males near her, because she knows that's what you kind of have to do. So it's showing she, understands the oppression, but, can't speak up herself about it because she knows, what would happen. And she's probably been through it herself. Maybe she was in the industry at some point. We don't know. But it also shows that women can be complicit in oppression as well, of, their fellow gender. And there's another woman who goes on the show who's, a terrible singer. And, she ends up being degraded and reduced to her sexuality. The one guy says, I wouldn't even have sex with you if you were covered in honey. And, someone's like, you're a bitch, your attitude. And it's once again how women are called bitchy, when they don't appeal to men or they, just express negativity. Fat phobia is a huge form of inequality in this as well. The lemons, I talked about, in the video games, they're the antagonists. They're the ones being killed. They do the cleaning. They're humiliated on the game shows. They're insulted by everyone, dusting around them, and they're generally seen as less. The racism in the show is not as overt, but I did notice a comment upon rewatching. So when Bing goes on, he's waiting, and there's a person who kind of comes in and, selects who's going to go next and be previewed on the show. And somebody's saying oh yeah, the ethnic one, in reference to him. So it kind of shows the forced diversity and progressiveness. So it's not genuine, but it's done to fulfill a quota and seem progressive and different. And classism, obviously, because there are those on bikes versus the lemons versus the judges versus whoever's running the system. And also those who won Hot Shot versus those on bikes. There's just a lot of classism. And we even see it, when Bing is originally one of the people that's on the bikes versus at the end, we see there's different levels. He has a bigger room and he can actually drink what looks like orange juice and he's not just eating processed stuff. So we can see just with that, the differences you get based on your position in class in this society. The institutions in this episode are the entertainment industry, the porn industry, exercise as a concept, gender, technology, working class, the idea of the American dream, and relationships. With identity, so we have Bing, who is a victim to the system, and he's an authentic character. He picks, there's different screens when you're on the bike. He picks the rolling hills screen, which is just basically you're on a bike and you just see the hills as you're biking rather than the entertainment forms. So it just shows his authentic character, but it shows that even people like that who value authenticity end up succumbing to the system because it's they think it's the only way out. Abby is also a victim to the system in the same way, where she's authentic but succumbs as well. The judges serve as metaphors for oppression, so they control everyone's fate, and those on Hot Shot, they try to appease them, the contestants, and serve them. So I think they're an analogy for that. And then Dustin, so he's one of the people on the bikes as well who's mean to the lemons and, watches the entertainment and fully engages in it, doesn't even question anything around him really. So I would say he represents the complicit customer, or, just consumers, who don't question society, and those in the working class also who side with their oppressors and further their own oppression. So he oppresses the lemons and the women with his sexualization comments towards them and his fatphobic comments towards the lemons. And he also represents male privilege because he is a white male. So at the end of the day, he still has white privilege and male privilege. So even in an oppressive system, there are still certain people that are worse off, even if they're in the working class. So being a woman, being a person of color, Abby, she's in the same class, but she's a woman. So she has that's leveraged against her. Whereas Dustin, he is a white male, so it's still not as bad as it is for other people. Readings that I thought were really relevant to this were All Hail the Maintainers and Idols of Promotion. So for All Hail the Maintainers, this article talked about the importance of maintenance as opposed to innovation. So in 15 Million Merits, those are on bikes are the maintainers, or the ones who maintain the technology by biking, which generates electricity for the world. And so the article, talked about how maintainers aren't acknowledged. The people on the bikes are not acknowledged, just expected to do this. and the society depends on maintainers, and they are essential. So, without the people that are pedaling these bikes, there is no power, and so they are essential. And yet they are not given any credit, and they are ignored. And so there's also the question that was raised during that article about who takes care of the maintainers. No one really. Society definitely doesn't, and so the people that are biking, no one takes care of them. They're just expected to come in day out, do their work. And they're not paid much, just like, maintainers. Maintainers are not paid much. The people on bikes are not. They don't earn a lot of merits. It's just enough to keep them, surviving. And that's kind of how it is with maintainers in real life. As far as the other article, Idols of Promotion, so this kind of talks about the economic shift from industrialization to entertainment. So like in 15 Million Merits, there's a heavy emphasis on entertainment. So the wealth remains to the top, whoever's running the system. This is like the judges are the people. We don't actually know who's above the judges. So, but whoever that would be, and the people that are just in those cubicles, like Bing is in, are even greater, or people that are even outside this whole building as a whole. And so from like the article talking about how today's celebrities, it's like consumption, production, and self-production, brands. It's kind of like how those on Hot Shot become brands themselves, like Selma. Abby is asked to be like saying something like, I want to be as big as Selma one day. So Selma becomes like a brand and an aspiration for people to look up to. And so in the article, it talked about like who is a hero, and it kind of defined it as someone who turns, yourself into a job. And, in 15 Million Merits, the heroes are those who escape it and make it as an entertainer in the 15 Million Merit world. And today's celebrities from the article, put forward a message that we should sell ourselves and brand ourselves. And this is relevant to 50 Million Merits because those that win Hot Shot become brands and sell themselves to the masses about, this is how you make it. This is how you make it big here. I wanted to just touch on some of the various points of other symbolism that didn't fit into neat categories for this. So the penguin, Abby makes these little origami penguins. She keeps one for herself and it gets taken away by the lemons. And she also gives one to Bing. So the penguin is a symbol of authenticity, even though one of the lemons who's cleaning, one gets rid of it, refers to it as detritus. I don't know how to pronounce it really well, detritus. And it means garbage. So it's ironic because it's one of the only things that are genuinely created, not for profit or ulterior motive, and it shows what capitalism and consumerism in like a society like this values. They don't value things that are authentic. They only want things that generate profits, and this little penguin origami is not generating profits for anybody, and it doesn't do anything. And it's also, as a symbol of authenticity, the system wants to crush this and get rid of it. So Abby's song itself, I think, is another important point of symbolism. So she says how it's a hand-me-down song from her family. So this also symbolizes authenticity because it's like a family thing that's very authentic. But it's ruined by Hot Shot because this is the song that she sings that leads to her further exploitation. I also thought it's an interesting note that this song that Abby sings is actually a running theme in Black Mirror, and you can hear it on several episodes. So it's very symbolic and important to the series. So yeah, the song itself also represents Bing and Abby and, their relationship. And so it can also, in a weird way, I feel like, talk about how those in the system of oppression, like they might try to like love and care about the system despite being put down by it. If you look into the lyrics saying, you can love me and put me down, but I'll still care for you, it kind of describes how people still try to love the system that puts them down, but yet you can't love a system that's created to oppress you. And so Bing shows Abby, how to get food from the vending machine, and I think it's symbolic because he helps get her food out from the machine that wasn't working, and so in this way, it's symbolically he gets her out of the system, but it also leads her to the demise. So it asks the question: is it really out? Did he contribute to her exploitation? And also he refers to Abby, talking about everything, with the term vicious cycle, which again represents capitalism. I also think it was important to note that how Bing originally got the 15 million merits was from his brother dying. This makes the betrayal with the Abby situation so much worse. It's just interesting to look at the difference of how in one situation he was given the merits, and the other one he actually worked fully for all of them. I think that's just another important point of symbolism. I think it's important to cover Bing's speech as well, because honestly, I would say it is one of the most raw moments in all of Black Mirror, and I think it's very crucial to the episode's understanding of just takeaways from it. So, Bing says when he is on stage, I knew I wanted you to listen, to really listen, not just pull a face like you're listening, like you do the rest of the time. A face like you're feeling instead of processing. So in this world, feelings are non-existent. No one is really listening to each other. It's just about processing and getting things done. He goes on to say, la-di-da, we sing and dance and tumble around and all you see up here. So he's once again referring to how entertainment is a spectacle and it's exploitative of the people that are on the show. He goes on to say, it's not people. You don't see people up here. It's all fodder. So fodder is an interesting word. We don't use it here, but I looked it up, and it can also mean something that's useful for one purpose and nothing else. So it's kind of like how these people are only up here to appease the judges, and that's it. It's useful for that purpose of the reality, like, entertainment aspect, but it's not meaningful in actual, like, broader way. It's just done for this show. Bing goes on to say, on the fake or the fodder is the more you love it, because fake fodder is the only thing that works anymore. Fake fodder is all we can stomach. So people are desensitized, and this is also why they can stomach these things, because it's just fake and they're used to it. He goes on to say, real pain, real viciousness, that's all we can take. Oh, that we can take. Yeah, stick a fat man up a pole and we'll laugh ourselves feral because we've earned the right. We've done cell time, and he's slacking the scum, so ha 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 at him. He's calling out the marginalization towards fat people, as well as how certain classes experience, entitlement. So they think they have this, like, warranted cruelty, in their minds. Like, well, I've been through this, so we get to laugh at them because I biked. And it kind of reminds me about how in our society, there's kind of this narrative how people who have pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, to use this phrase, they get to, laugh at other poor people because I made it. I made money and I made it out of oppression. So you are slacking. It's just, once again, people who are in the lower classes of society are blamed, and they are treated as if they're not doing anything to get themselves out of their oppression. Whereas the lemons in the society, they don't want to be there. They're doing their job, they're cleaning, but there's nothing they can do. Once they're in this position, there's nothing even talked about of upward mobility. Just like in our society, it's very hard to get out of these lower stages. There's nothing talked about how they can stop being a lemon or how they get to that point. I mean, it's inferred that, it's because they stop biking, and that's how they're just relegated to this, but it seems like a permanent thing. So it's like there's no coming back. There's no opportunity to just, well, try again. It just seems like once you do something, you're stuck there. So Bing goes on to say, we're so out of our minds with desperation, we don't know any better. I referenced this earlier. There's desperation for authenticity in a consumer society, and that's why people end up liking his speech in the show and in real life. He says, all we know is fake fodder and buying shit. That's how we speak to each other. How we express ourselves is buying shit. That's a great summary of capitalism, as spoken by Bing here. Very relevant to our world. There's such an emphasis on buying, consuming. Especially with the rise of online shopping and Amazon. It's just really how people show they care is buying stuff. He references MLK by saying, I have a dream. And it's because that speech by MLK was, a very authentic, call to action. He's calling to action here by bringing up MLK. But it's also showing how ridiculous the reality is, because in this scenario, he's referencing MLK, one of the most prominent leaders of civil rights movement, in this reality of fake shit. He's referencing it here very, very deliberately to show how ridiculous the world they live in is. Back then they had real dreams as well. With MLK and the civil rights, they had actual dreams. He's saying here, they don't have dreams anymore because everything is fake and manufactured and, not real dreams. So he goes on to say, the peak of our dreams is a new hat for our doppel, a hat that doesn't exist. It's not even there. We buy shit that's not even there. Really reminds me of, like, in-game currency or, like, games, like apps. People spend real money on these apps. So, for example, I play a game that's like a dress-up game. It's called Love Nikki, if you've heard of it. And people spend real money to get outfits in this game. And it's literally what Bing is saying here. We're spending money, real money that we're earning, on stuff that doesn't exist. And people drop money on video games and virtual things all of the time. This is very relevant to this. Bing says, show us something real and free and beautiful, and you couldn't. It would break us. We're too numb for it, and our minds would choke. There's only so much wonder we can bear, and that's why when you find any wonder whatsoever, you dole it out in meager portions. And only then till it's augmented and packaged and pumped through 10,000 Prius and filters till it's nothing more than a meaningless series of lights while we ride day in, day out, going where, powering what, all tiny cells and tiny screens, and bigger cells and bigger screens, and fuck you, that's what it boils down to, fuck you. There's a lot to go through with this, but filters, we obviously have a lot of filters in our world, as they do here, and things that are authentic are turned fake, like Abby and also the penguin. And It also calls to attention how they don't even know what they're doing it all for. That's also a thing in capitalism. It's like, why are we doing all this? Like, we're doing it because we're told it's what we have to do. We just have to survive this way. It's very relevant to that. This is where he continues to get very, very angry, and he just starts cursing, fuck you for sitting there and slowly knitting things worse, fuck you in your spotlight and sanctimonious faces, and fuck you all for taking the one thing I ever came close to anything real about anything, for oozing it around and crushing it into a bone, into a joke, one more ugly joke in a kingdom of millions, then fuck you for happening, fuck you for me, for us, for everyone, fuck you. So here's this final confrontation to the system directly, and it also relates to Nosedive with how cursing is seen as empowering, because in this world it's very fake and everything is so clipped and manufactured, and this cursing is him finally letting go. And it reminds me of Nosedive, where at the end, she's cursing. It's very different tones, but it's still, similar in the way that it's seen as empowering. After the speech, the audience looks to each other, like being mentioned, they have no idea how to react or handle something that's real, so they're just sitting there looking at each other. They don't know what to do. And there's a pause, very purposeful pause to see, well, is the system actually going to change? No, of course it doesn't. And so it's back to being fake again. So the judges pick up, and, no matter what, the system remains. It's very ironic for one of the judges to be like, authenticity is in short supply. Very relevant to how the system tries to act like it's not causing problems, or it's not causing the oppression, or that it understands the people it's oppressing. It doesn't. It's them playing, once again, to act like they understand. They don't. So Bing sadly ends up selling out to the same system which he's trying to fight. And in his larger cubicle, he gets a larger cubicle. He has a plastic penguin in there, so he has a piece of Abby with him, but it's manufactured and not handmade like the original. So, once again, showing how things that are genuine get distorted through this system. And also, kind of like how Abby gets turned into, like, the porn, You end up seeing her later on, and she looks very lifeless, very defeated, just very out of it. So it just shows, like, same thing with her. She went through the same thing where, her fate, she, unfortunately, is not authentic anymore, and she is fully in the system. And so we see Bing, staring like at the outside, and it's a contrast of nature with the cubicles. So Bing's story leaves viewers, feeling heartbroken and hopeless. This represents how many people in the system of capitalism, feel hopeless. We root for Bing to overthrow the system and resist. Unlike Abby, yet he also ultimately succumbs. He thinks he will escape his cubicle prison, but like he foreshadows in his speech, he is just in a bigger cell. He is still imprisoned and can't reach the outside. He's staring at these trees from his like bigger cell thing. He's staring at the trees and the sky, but he's not outside still. So it shows that despite how much one conforms, they cannot escape oppression. When Bing acted as a good worker, his conditions were not bettered. When he conformed by becoming a part of the same system that oppresses him still, he is also ultimately still in prison and can only watch longingly from a distance. His expression is blank as he stares on. Black Mirror paints a picture that describes conforming to a system as pointless, and the only way to be freed of said system is to get rid of it entirely. But obviously those in power have a vested interest in maintaining the system of oppression as it benefits them. So working class individuals are used by the upper class. They do all the work for them. They have these awful conditions, and it's reminiscent in general of the working class in society in this episode. And so they are the backbone of society, and yet they are disrespected and kept in horrible conditions while the rich only get richer.